Good evening and welcome to our virtual event tonight. I'm Courtney from the Wayland Public Library, and I have the privilege of introducing Tyler Stovall, Professor of History and Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Fordham University. Professor Stovall specializes in the history of modern and 20th century France, with particular interest in questions of race and class, Blackness, and post-colonial and transnational history. His books include Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, The Rise of the Paris Red Belt, and, hot off the presses, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea. Thank you to Professor Stovall for joining us tonight. This event is made possible through a collaboration between several Massachusetts libraries, including Wayland, Tewksbury, North Andover, and Andover's Memorial Hall Library. Welcome, everyone. It's also made possible by our respected library friends organizations and by a grant from the Wayland Cultural Council, which is a local agency supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency, in support of our Wayland Reads 2021 series. This program is being recorded for broadcast on Wayland's cable access station and will also be made accessible on YouTube. Professor Stovall will present for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Please enter your questions at any point using the Zoom Q&A feature, and I will read them aloud at the appropriate time. So again, many thanks to Professor Stovall for joining us tonight, and now I will stop talking and hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out to hear me talk about my work. Libraries have a special place in my heart ever since I was a little kid and used to astonish librarians by taking out the limit of books for the year every Friday. So I got addicted to books at libraries and I haven't stopped since. So it is my great pleasure tonight to talk a bit about my own book, White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea. And I wanted to talk about just the introduction first, and then I want to go on to speak about the book as a whole. Basically, the book looks at the ways in which race and freedom interact in world history, especially the history of France and the United States. In deciding to start the book years ago, I was inspired by an incident involving the US Capitol building. If we could have image one, please. Which was both seen as a great temple of liberty, but also seen as a building that had its own difficult history. So, and of course, oops, if we could have the first slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so there's a picture of the Capitol building in all its glory, the vision of the Capitol building that is familiar to tourists from throughout the United States and around the world. But of course, the Capitol building has become especially notable recently because of the events that happened on January 6th of this year. If we can have the next slide, please. On January 6th, as you all know, a large and mostly white mob of aggrieved citizens invaded the Capitol building, angry at the results of the presidential election, and created the first insurrection in the memory of most living Americans on American soil. Now, this was a pretty spectacular event. I think I, like many other Americans, was really upset and outraged and just full of disbelief that this kind of thing could happen. But I want to talk about a couple aspects of this event that really tie into my book, and then I'll lead into the book more specifically. First of all, was the emphasis on freedom that the crowd cried out. They talked about invading the Capitol building to restore their lost freedoms, to restore in particular their rights to vote, or the rights for their votes to be counted, and their rights to determine their own futures in general. So the language of freedom was very important in this movement. The other thing that was very important was, frankly, the whiteness of this movement. One of my reactions was, after seeing a largely white crowd invade one of the most central buildings of the US government, with claiming to overthrow the US government, and then simply being allowed to walk out mostly without being harassed or even arrested at all, was, well, this is really white privilege on the mark. Nobody can tell me after this that freedom in America is not in part, white freedom. Whites have privileges that others do not, because I was imagining what would have happened if this had been a Black Lives Matter march or invasion of the US Capitol building. But in starting my book, I wanted to look at another aspect of the history of the Capitol building, obviously because I started it long before January 6th. And that was the beginnings of rumors at the beginning of the 21st century that the Capitol building had been in part built by slaves and slave labor. So I just want to start from reading the introduction to the book and get into that a bit. So I start off by saying, at the dawn of the 21st century, if we can have the next slide, please, the American Congress appointed a task force to investigate the veracity of a persistent rumor that the US Capitol building had been built by the labor of Black slaves. Rumors to this effect had existed for some time, but recent revelations of receipts for payments for slaves found in the Treasury Department had lent them new credence. Accordingly, Congress created the Slave Labor Task Force in order to investigate the rumors and decide what, if anything, the federal government should do in response to them. In 2005, the task force released its report entitled History of Slave Laborers in the Construction of the United States Capitol, concluding that the rumors were true. And I just quote a bit from the report, saying, soon after it was finished in the 1820s, the Capitol began to be called the Temple of Liberty because it was dedicated to the cherished ideas of freedom, equality, and self-determination. How then can a building steeped in those noble principles have been constructed with the help of slave labor? The report's conclusions led Congress to take several actions to rectify the historical record and acknowledge the role played by African slaves in building the Capitol. Unlike most congressional activities at this time, they represented a bipartisan effort, reaffirming the accord of both Democrats and Republicans. In 2007, Congress agreed to rename the Great Hall of the Capitol Visitor Center Emancipation Hall in honor of the slaves who helped build it. As Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. argued, quote, emancipation is the great enduring theme of our nation's still unfolding history. Without emancipation, our house divided would not have stood. We would not be a beacon of freedom and democracy around the world. We would never have had, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, a new birth of freedom. Next slide, please. Both the House and the Senate overwhelmingly approved the measure in November 2007, and President George W. Bush signed it into law the following January. The story of Emancipation Hall in many ways tells an inspiring and moving story of a nation's willingness to come to terms with cross-party lines with its slave heritage. But it also raises some interesting and ultimately rather unsettling questions. Why would one name a building constructed by slaves Emancipation Hall as a way of honoring their legacy and history? They certainly were not emancipated when they worked there. Freedom undoubtedly represented the aspiration of those whose forced labor built the Capitol and so much of America, but it was definitely not their reality and did not express the nature of their lives. Probably very few of them lived to see the end of slavery. How could naming the structure they built emancipation illustrate the nature of lives lived without freedom? If one really wanted to acknowledge them, why not call the building Slave Hall? Why would it be impossible to imagine an official government building in a country that claimed freedom as its greatest value with that name? Did the name Emancipation Hall, far from honoring the slaves who helped build it, instead represent yet another denial of their own history? If so, why did all of official Washington, including African-American legislators descended from slaves, rush to embrace it? So, in making that, in quoting that section and beginning with this, with the beginning of my book, I wanted to make a couple points. First of all, those people that invaded the US Capitol building on January 6th, far from celebrating a tradition of freedom, were in effect referencing a very older, much older tradition of oppression of Black people, of the Capitol building as a temple against freedom. So you had this whole balance between slavery and freedom represented by the Capitol building past and present. And in some ways, this suggested a broader contradiction that many historians, a nation like the United States, or a nation like France for that matter, that has in so many ways stood for freedom, and yet has at the same time been bedeviled by the curse of racial polarization and racism. Historians often note, for example, that the 18th century, which saw the birth of the Enlightenment, and a real emphasis on the ideal of freedom, was also the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So slavery and freedom coexisted together. Many people approaching this history have argued that, in effect, this was an ultimate contradiction between the two, that there was a real paradox that one had to explain, if one could, between a belief in freedom and a practice of racism and slavery. So what I decided to do on my book, because I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of contradictions that can't be explained, is to try and figure out what was the deeper unity between these two concepts. How could freedom and racism go together, in other words? And what I decided was freedom in many ways has a history of being grounded in race. That, to put it very simply, to be white is to be free is to be white. In other words, that freedom and racism in some ways go together if one defines the ability to be free in racial terms. If one sees that whites are supposed to be free because they have the ability to enjoy freedom, the ability to achieve freedom, and therefore, by extension, those who are not white do not deserve freedom because they do not have that ability to achieve that ideal, then you have a definition of freedom that is troubling in many ways, and yet in many ways, I think also fits the historical record, even more so than the idea that freedom and racism are contradictions. So I call them at one point enemy brothers, concepts that are opposed, but also in some ways go together. And I decided, once I figured this out, to write a history, looking at how these two concepts overlapped in the modern world. As Courtney told you, I am a historian of France by training. I'm also an American by birth and education. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to adopt those two nations as the key areas in which I wanted to explore this relationship between freedom and race. But there are other reasons. Most notably, France and the United States are two countries that perhaps more than any others in the world see freedom as lying at the heart of their national identities. For the French, for example, the word French comes from the word Franc, which came from the Germanic word for free. So when the Franks settled what had been Gaul, they immediately named it after a name that France that meant freedom in their tongue. The key words of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, emphasized liberty above all. And the French Revolution was seen as an event that spread liberty throughout Europe, if not the world. Similarly, the United States is a nation that is, above all, grounded in the idea of freedom. From its revolution against the British in the 18th century to its struggles against totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, the United States is seen as always embracing the idea of freedom, and even more so in its domestic politics, emphasizing the rights of the individual citizen. So how do such nations then adopt an idea of white freedom? How do they racialize, in effect, their own ideas of freedom? It's worth noting, for example, that the French Revolution gave rise to the Haitian Revolution, which was ultimately suppressed or tried to be suppressed by Napoleon's government. Napoleon's government tried to suppress it and failed. It did suppress revolutions in other parts of the slave Caribbean, but it failed to do so in Haiti. It's also worth noting that the American Revolution, and this is to note something that's been quite controversial recently, did create a nation that emphasized the principles of freedom, but at the same time practiced slavery. And in fact, the practice of slavery, although it declined in some parts of the newly independent United States, notably New England, grew in other parts. So the United States by the early 19th century was a powerful slave nation, a slave republic. And so I try and follow this history throughout the 19th to 20th century, starting with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. One of the things I look at, and this is probably in some ways the most interesting chapter of the book, is I look at the Statue of Liberty, which is probably the greatest symbol of freedom, not just in the United States, but in the world today. In fact, there are many replicas of the Statue of Liberty scattered in countries throughout the world. Americans have been taught that this symbolizes freedom, and it absolutely does. But it also symbolizes a certain vision of freedom, a vision that is racially formed. And it's interesting because the Statue of Liberty is also a monument that belongs both to France, where it was created and designed, and to the United States, where it was erected and still stands to this day. In France, the Statue of Liberty, the vision of the Statue of Liberty was in effect designed against the appeals of revolution. It contrasted with an image known as Marianne, which is an image of a woman leading a revolutionary army into battle. The Statue of Liberty, as it was finally created, is much more demure, much less revolutionary. It is much less, in effect, savage. And it was this that appealed in many ways to the Americans who received the Statue of Liberty and erected it as their great totem of freedom. The Statue of Liberty actually has broken chains at the feet of the statue, but they're pretty much invisible unless you have a helicopter and can fly up to see them. It is an emblem that sees freedom as, first of all, very responsible, not warlike, and ultimately with white features. One of the interesting aspects of the history of the Statue of Liberty is its relationship to immigration, because for the most part, Americans argue that the Statue of Liberty was a symbol of welcome to immigration in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. That is certainly how many immigrants saw it. But many Americans, on the other hand, saw it as a statue against freedom, against immigration, trying to protect America's shores against the onrush of immigrants. The Statue of Liberty really doesn't become a symbol of immigration until two things happen. First of all, by the 1930s, there are fewer immigrants coming in. It's a depression that is a real decline in immigration. So you do not have the same kinds of large numbers of immigrant masses in American cities. It also happens at a time when immigrants are now in their second generation. You have the children of the immigrants who came from 1880s to 1910s, who have grown up Americans speaking fluent English and integrated into American society. And in effect, they've grown up white. So there's a wonderful portrait of the Statue of Liberty that dates from World War II, which shows the Statue of Liberty welcoming immigrant children that are labeled Italian American, for example, or German American. They all look very white. There are no African American children, for example. And they are all seen as belonging to the Statue of Liberty, who calls them my children. So the message of the Statue of Liberty is one welcoming people to freedom, but is one welcoming people to white freedom. And one of the things I note in my book is that America's greatest symbol of liberty is a statue that faces towards Europe, that supposedly welcomes white immigrants to the United States. There is no equivalent of the Statue of Liberty, for example, on San Francisco Island, which San Francisco's Angel Island, which is the place where many Chinese immigrants landed in the 19th century. There is no Statue of Liberty on the US-Mexico border, for example. And there is certainly no Statue of Liberty in Charleston, South Carolina, or other places that mark the US end of the Middle Passage. In fact, one of the things the Statue of Liberty does is, by its location in New York Harbor, it tends to hide the fact that New York Harbor was itself one of America's great slave ports. So in many ways, it would be ultimately, more accurate historically to have the Statue of Liberty remain where it is, but also another statue that commemorates slavery and slave revolts in New York City. So really illustrating the relationship between freedom and race, between freedom and slavery in American history. So these are some of the main themes that I look at in my book. But let me emphasize one other theme, which is that white freedom is not the only kind of freedom there is. For all the attempts to exclude peoples of color from freedom and liberty, either conceptually or in reality, there have also been movements by people of color, and other people as well, to demand a truly universal freedom, to demand the opening of the idea of freedom to all people, irregardless of color. So this is partly also the history of white freedom, the resistance against it. This is the history, for example, of the civil rights movement. in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is the history of the fight for Asian inclusion in citizenship in America during the 20th century. It's the fight for decolonization and the end of colonial empires, especially the British and French empires after World War II. So I end the book on a positive note, because I think for all the problems that have been associated with white freedom, at the same time, there remains a powerful movement against it and a movement that demands for freedom for all. And I think ultimately this is our legacy for the future. I'm a historian, I look to the past, but I think it's also important for me to look to the future. And I think in some ways, the future has real promise. So thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, Courtney, let me just turn it back to you.
Sure. So I encourage folks to enter their questions in the Q&A. I have a few, but please add yours at any time. So I'm wondering if you could go back to the basics and just repeat your thesis for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My thesis is simply this, that freedom is something that is shaped by different factors, but one of them is race. In other words, to be free, one aspect of the development of freedom in the modern world is the way in which it has been racially shaped by ideas of race and racism. So that freedom has in many ways been associated with characteristics that are also associated with whiteness. In other words, if you want to be free, there is a sense, if you are able to be free, there is a sense that you are supposed to be in one part of the racial, on one side of the racial divide. You are supposed to be white. That whiteness has its own also set of characteristics, and one of the main characteristics of whiteness is the ability to be free. This develops over time. It develops most powerfully, of course, with the heyday of African slavery, which really stamps the idea that if blackness is slavery, then whiteness is freedom. And to a large extent, especially if you look at people writing during the 18th century and the 19th century, this is the point they make. You know, being white means not being a slave. And it's important to emphasize that that was not always true by any means. In fact, really not until the 18th century, there were lots of white slaves in both Europe and even America, either indentured servants or in some cases, literally slaves. But by the 18th century, white slavery had largely died out in Europe. Indentured servitude had largely died out in the United States. And so people in bondage, therefore, were almost always people of color. And if you believed that that was a natural state of being, then the flip side was also true. If being a black meant being a slave, then being white meant being free. And so I think these two concepts developed in tandem in relationship to each other, which is why I wanted to emphasize at the end that, you know, the struggle for universal freedom is also a part of this history, because it's a struggle precisely against that association that, you know, also exists really at the same time and throughout the same history.
So in simplistic terms, we're kind of defining white freedom. If there were no slavery or oppression, we could not define it as, we're defining it as the opposite.
Right.
Of a certain race or set of privileges or lack of privileges.
Right.
Okay.
And let me just add also that the thing about slavery, of course, is it's practiced in the United States in particular. This is not true everywhere, that slavery in America is hereditary. You were born a slave, right? Just as you were born into a racial grouping, right? Which means that if you're born as a slave, you can also be born free, right?
Yeah. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your chapter about pirates and children and earlier definitions of freedom.
Okay, this is the Peter Pan chapter in some ways. I had a lot of fun with that chapter. But basically what I was looking at in this chapter, which is the first chapter of the book, was alternate visions of freedom, okay, that exist before the idea of white freedom, which is in many ways tied to sort of the rise of middle-class society, rise of capitalism, the emphasis on property rights. I wanted to look at groups that represented a different vision of freedom as wildness. And one of the things I start off by emphasizing is the idea that freedom we're always used to think of freedom as something that's positive, but the word freedom can also have negative connotations. Think of the word libertine, think of the word license, for example. Think of the word anarchy. These are all examples of freedom that is seen as negative. Okay, this is seen as lawlessness, for example, freedom that has to be overcome. As the old saying goes, your right to swing your fist ends at my nose, right? Freedom has to be limited to something that will not harm other people. And, you know, if you want an example of that, look at the contemporary debate about whether people should wear masks or not, whether people should have the right to wear masks, should have the freedom to wear masks, even if by exercising that freedom, it will then infect other people. Okay, so that's one of the things I wanted to look at. And I just chose to focus on pirates and children because both in different ways are seen as groups that are exercising a kind of wild, or what I call savage freedom, freedom that is unbounded by law, freedom that is ultimately has to be overcome in order for a civilized society to thrive. And it's overcome in different ways. Pirates, of course, have to be exterminated. Children have to be made to grow up, right? And so in a story like Peter Pan, you in effect get both. The pirates are killed. The children end up leaving Never Never Land, going back to middle-class London, and at the end becoming, as the saying goes, men with beards and jobs, right? Having forgotten their wild child ideas of freedom. It's one of the reasons why the history of adolescence in the 20th century has been so tempestuous, because adolescence, the idea of the rebel teenager is the idea of somebody who's trying to cling on to his freedom, even though he or she is now becoming an adult. And that is seen as in many ways attractive, but also ultimately wrong, because people have to grow up in order to be part of civilized society. Right?
Thank you.
And then pirates have to be literally stamped out, because pirates are also a threat to property. But, you know, it's one of the reasons why pirate-themed birthday parties are so popular to this day, right?
It wasn't inevitable that these words liberty and freedom would come to be the ideals of the US and France, it sounds like.
You know, it wasn't inevitable at all, of course, but the United States in particular was a country that developed in interaction with Native peoples. And it's interesting because Native peoples were another group I could have added into chapter 1. And in fact, I do at certain points, because they also represent a kind of freedom that ultimately has to be suppressed for the United States to survive, right? And it's brutally suppressed, land seized, people murdered, so on and so forth. But they're the ultimate representatives in some ways of savage freedom. So I don't think it was inevitable, but the idea of freedom is so powerful. It is so empowering, right? And if you're talking about a society that is based on the rights of the individual, then freedom becomes the natural example of those rights. And again, it's important to emphasize that not all societies are. Many societies are based on caste, for example, or based on class. Or when I look at the history of Nazi Germany, for example, true freedom in Nazi Germany came from one's racial integration into the state, right? Being a part of the Nazi state, right? Individual freedom was not important. Being integrated to the state was what counted as true freedom, right? So it's certainly not an ideal that's practiced everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do have some questions from the audience. Mm-hmm. So I will start with Michelle is asking, how do you compare France and the US in terms of race relations now? She says, I know France has more recently had issues with the Muslim population, but I'm not aware of how those with African and Caribbean descent are treated. And the second part of her question is, how did France treat their slaves in comparison to enslaved people in the US?
Okay, well, two very big questions. Let me start by just talking about race relations now in both France and the United States, because it's a very complex situation. France has large populations of color. I mean, something like 1/10 of the nation is of Muslim heritage or faith, right? And you also have large North African and even some East Asian people, a lot of people from the Caribbean. There is an official ideology in France that race does not exist as an official ideal, right? So the big difference, for example, is that in the United States, the census does have racial statistics included in it. In France, that is against the law. You're not allowed to talk about race as an existing factor in official terms. My feeling as an American is that sometimes that leads to a bit of blindness. There was once a case of an American reporter who was assigned to a legion of French police during the 2005 uprisings in the Paris suburbs, which are largely people of color in battle with the police. And at one point he asked the police captain, so why are none of the police officers here people of color? Why are they all white? And the response was, we don't think in those terms. They are all citizens of the Republic. They're all equal. Their racial background doesn't make any difference. Well, yeah, in one sense, that's probably true. But when you have a crowd of mostly young people of color facing off against an all-white police detachment, it's really hard to argue that the race does not factor in there at all, especially when the same pattern is repeated all over the country and over from years to years to years. So there is a certain belief that you should, to talk about race is to engage in racism, let's put it that way. And therefore, if we don't talk about it, we don't have to worry about it. It's like the old child story of a horrible, horrible monster against whom there was no defense except one, shutting your eyes and pretending it didn't exist because it believed if you couldn't see it, it couldn't see you, right? So there's something like that going on. To answer the other question, I forget the second part of the question.
It was about comparison between slavery in France.
Slavery in France and slavery in the United States. One of the things to emphasize about France is that, unlike the United States, slavery did, for the most part, not exist in mainland France itself. It existed in the colonies of the Caribbean, above all. In fact, there was a law, or rather a tradition, that said that literally there are no slaves in France, that if a slave set foot on French soil, French European soil, she or he should automatically be able to go free. And there were actually slaves during the 18th century that waged court cases and won their freedom because of that principle. So that's one side of it. On the other hand, is the fact that France was the owner of the colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. Haiti was the most profitable slave colony in the world. In fact, in some ways, the most profitable slave colony the world has ever seen. It produced a very large percentage of all the sugar that came from the New World, all of the New World, to Europe in the 18th century. And conditions were truly brutal in Haiti. I mean, there were laws against, for example, burning your slaves alive, because people did burn their slaves alive, right? So the treatment, and these were, French slave owners. So the treatment of French slaves, not slaves in France, but French slaves, was extremely brutal, probably more brutal than the United States. In fact, the people have argued that Haiti, for a long time, had much greater connections with Africa, because Haitian slaves, or the slaves of Saint-Domingue, died off more quickly, and therefore they had to continually import new ones from Africa, therefore renewing the African traditions. And one final footnote on this, I can't resist this because it's such an outrageous story. For years after Haiti achieved independence, Haiti had to pay reparations to France because of its confiscation of French property. Now, most of the French property, of course, was the slaves themselves, right? But they nonetheless had to pay reparations to France. And these payments continued until about 10 years ago, when the Haitian earthquake happened and the Haitian French government decided at long last, maybe it should forgive this debt.
Wow.
I mean, of all the outrageous things I've ever heard of, that's got to be right up there.
Wow. Yeah. Let's see, we have a couple of questions about the history of slavery and abolition in America. So one person is asking, why has the emphasis always been on the South as being the ports where slaves were first brought into this country? How active was New York Harbor in the slave trade?
A couple points about that. First of all, people have often made the point that if it was the ports in the South that the slaves came to, they often came in ships from New England, right? So there's that aspect of it. But yeah, New York was a very active slave port. I think at one point in the early 19th century, it was second only to Charleston, South Carolina. And Charleston was, of course, far and away the biggest slave port. But New York was up there too, because partly it had the transportation infrastructure to get slaves to the South and other parts of the country as well. So it was, yeah, and there are histories of, for example, slave revolts in New York City in the 18th century, for example, that historians have documented. So, and then of course there was what was discovered a few years ago, the slave burial ground near Wall Street in Manhattan, which had the remains of thousands of slaves, thousands of slave bodies, which just showed that, you know, this was an important presence in early New York City. So.
Yeah, it's interesting that we like to push that history south.
Yes.
And
Yes.
ignore it up here. I was just learning about Peter Faneuil in Boston and Faneuil Hall. His family made their money off the slave trade, and
Right.
Faneuil Hall is seen as a cradle of liberty.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and there was some movement to make a monument, about an auction block monument right near it. Ultimately didn't go through, but anyway, I'm going on and on. So another person is asking about New England as being one of the early places opposed to slavery. Why was that? Why was New England any different?
Okay, well, in answering that point, let me start off in a slightly different way. I think one of the things I argue in my book is that between the American Revolution and the Civil War, you had a gradual increase in the voting rights for white American men, obviously not for women who didn't get the vote till 1920, but for men, there was pretty much universal franchise by the 1850s, certainly by the decade before the Civil War. But while you had the franchise being increased for white men, it declined actually for Black men. So that all the states admitted to the Union after the early 19th century, none of them had allowed Black men to vote. The only states that allowed Black men to vote were basically states in New England by this point, and a couple others, but mostly it was New England states. So New England does present this paradox in a number of different ways. First of all, it is a region that is in many ways very much opposed to slavery. You know, it is a region that, for example, celebrates John Brown when he, you know, in his war in Kansas in the 1850s. So it is a region that is the heart of, in many ways, of abolitionism. It is also a region that is profiting from the slave trade, right? And then finally, New England was where the Industrial Revolution in America began. That's the other thing it's important to emphasize about New England in the early 19th century. And, you know, industrial labor was in many ways seen as a kind of slavery too, you know, in terms of the rigorous conditions that people had to live under and work under. So at the same time, New England had a strong intellectual tradition of freedom, right? And that translated into reaction against slavery. So, you know, and New England forces were very prominent in the Civil War. I should say I'm from Ohio, actually, which is another state that was very prominent in fighting the Civil War. If you any county courthouse you go to in Ohio, there's always a statue, a memorial to the Union dead, prominently in front of it. So, and I think New England is probably similar.
I was just thinking about and the idea of civilizing formerly enslaved people, and how that was an argument for their freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let me switch back to France for a moment.
Sure.
Because one of the other sort of paradoxes that inspired this book for me was the paradox of the struggle for republicanism and democracy in France and also Britain during the 19th century went hand in hand with the creation of overseas empires, right? So on the one hand, you had a country like France, which under the Third Republic, which was established in 1870 after a revolution against an empire, established France as a republic, as a nation of citizens free to vote for whoever would rule them, right? This regime also goes on to establish the greatest empire in French history, which is an empire of subjects, not citizens. And one of the reasons they do so is much of European imperialism was actually inspired by a rejection of the slave trade, by a fight against the slave trade. So, for example, European nations had long had sort of trading posts on the African coast in West Africa, where slaves had been sent from. In the early 19th century, middle 19th century, they began going into the interior of Africa to stamp out the slave trade, because the argument was you couldn't just stop taking the slaves at the coast. You had to go out into the interior where the slaves were first imprisoned and then stop the slave trade. So part of the justification of empire was the idea we need to establish empires to stamp out the slave trade, but it soon shifted into an idea we need to establish empires to civilize these people so they can become citizens as well. And so it was called in France, it was called assimilation. The idea that you will assimilate the natives of Tunisia, of Cameroon, of Senegal into being like French people, into being civilized. Now, that didn't work for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, was the French hardly invested any money into education for the youth of their colonies, right? So they talked about how it was important to them to learn, but they didn't invest money in enabling them to learn. So after about a generation, they decided this practice really isn't working. So instead, they shifted to another more racially grounded idea called association, which argued that, well, people have different strengths and different qualities, and they develop in different ways. And the best we can do is allow people to develop to their maximum capability. And the clear assumption, of course, was that people with brown and black skin did not have the same capability for civilization that people with white skin did. Leave aside the fact that you weren't investing in the same kind of level in their education, but just that, you know, they were constitutionally, racially incapable of becoming civilized.
So it's chicken and egg sometimes. Are we going to, are people of color allowed to be free? I can't articulate it clearly, but yeah, it goes in a cycle, it sounds like.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have another question here. Forgive me if I botch it a little. What does history teach us for achieving freedom in the US without the qualifier of white freedom? It seems Haiti should have set the precedent, but yet in countries that have freed themselves from white control, seem to then embrace shades of whiteness within the Black population. For example, lighter skin defines freedom.
No, I think that's a good point. One point about Haiti, first of all, since the questioner made that remark. Haiti was a great slave revolt, one of the greatest slave revolts in human history. Haiti was completely isolated as a result of the triumph of the slaves. It was seen as the triumph of barbarism. The United States tried to keep it isolated, did not trade with it. France, we've already seen what France's reaction was. So it was a country that, you know, in a world that championed the idea of freedom, the price of blacks who achieved, the penalty of blacks who achieved freedom was complete isolation and being shunned, right? Because blacks ultimately were not supposed to be free, right? And they were not supposed to fight for their freedom, and they were certainly not supposed to kill white people in order to achieve their freedom. So, so yeah, I think that, but you know, at the same time, I think if you talk about ideas of the history of fight for universal freedom, Haiti has a real place in that history. It's a major landmark for this vision of universal freedom, because what the Haitians did was took the idea of freedom to its logical extension. They said, if people are supposed to be free, then all people should be free, including us, right? And it really exposed the sort of racial nature of the freedom, that the reaction they got was complete isolation and shunning instead of celebration. Right? So to answer the second part of the question, which is really interesting, what about different, like a colorism among different groups, you know, different groups of blacks? I mean, for example, in Washington, D.C., they used to have the tradition of the paper bag parties. If your skin was darker than a paper bag, you weren't allowed in. Right. And you have lots of similar traditions among, you know, many different groups. I mean, colorism is in many ways is truly a global phenomenon that exists among many groups of people. But I think the root of it is ultimately white racism. That, you know, colorism is, you know, is basically people's attempts to be as white as possible. You know, or as the saying used to go, light, bright, and damn near white. Right. And so I think the struggle against whiteness and struggle against white freedom ultimately is also a struggle against these kinds of beliefs as well. You know, one of the aspects of the Black Power movement that was most influential in the 1960s was to celebrate African visual heritage. That was the importance of the Afro. In other words, have hair that looked African, right? not that, you know, looked white, not wear a wig, right? Champion dark skin. And in many ways, that was the most important legacy of that movement, right? The fact that people could look in the mirror and feel proud of how they looked, not ashamed.
And not trying to assimilate, yeah.
Right.
So then the next question goes back to January 6th. And what do you see happening in the aftermath of the January 6th events, alongside the work by many of recent times to bring change and equity in this country?
Okay.
So there's both, there's a Black Lives Matter movement and then this insurrection, and where do you see that going?
Well, let me go back a little bit farther, just a few months farther, to another incident, which was the murder of George Floyd, which really made Black Lives Matter a truly national, in fact, international movement. And one of the things that I think struck me and many other African Americans about that movement was the fact that it became so massive and was embraced by so many white people in America, and not just America either, in ways that we hadn't known of before. And there's been an awful lot of people trying to figure out why that was so. I mean, one argument is that because of COVID, everybody was stuck at home and they were watching their TV or so looking at their computers, and they were more conscious of these kinds of events. I don't know, but I thought it was a hopeful sign. And likewise, I thought that the reaction to January 6th, and again, first of all, I think many of us just shared it was just like hard to believe that was happening, right? And by the way, I did not have anything to do with January 6th and tried to promote my book, okay? Let me just establish that. But the fact also that you had this was really white privilege on parade, and it was condemned as such in many quarters of the country. And it was seen as a problem rather than just sort of the normal ways that things are, right? And people immediately made that comparison of, what would have happened had this been a Black Lives Matter march. Right. Because the distinction was just so flagrant. But things like that have happened before. But the fact that this was, this immediately led to the impeachment a week later of a sitting president. That's pretty impressive, right? And it's hard to imagine that happening before.
True. Let's see. So this is my question. I'm thinking about American public education and how we're grappling with how to be teaching about slavery and hard subjects and talking about race and racism. So how do you imagine it might look to teach, for example, high school students to understand this history of freedom and race and the relationship between them? So what comes to mind for me is that I think of my history education in maybe middle school more than high school as sort of this nation building, national narrative, this sort of forward progress and proud. So what would it look like to teach this?
Right. And I think that is the key narrative, and something that I'm in some ways challenging, is that there's this bright shining object called freedom that exists at the heart of American life, and more people on the margins of American life are drawn into it, right, until everybody's part of it. And I'm arguing something different, that in fact, the whole image of freedom is created through exclusions as well as inclusions. And a lot of those inclusions and exclusions are racialized. But it's an interesting question to talk about teaching this to young people, because I'm going to say something, I think in some ways it's sort of hopeful, that young people are more open to different ideas. And also young people are more habituated, used to the idea of, in some ways at least, of racial equality, of people being kindred across racial lines. Now, this is not always the case. One of the things I talk about in the book was one of the hearts of the civil rights movement was the fight against school segregation. And I talk about the fact that in many ways, that was a failed battle. With the decline of busing after the 1980s, American schools are still segregated to a large extent. And that is probably the most important defeat, I would say, of the civil rights movement. It's an important one too. But I think nonetheless, young people are simply more likely to believe that there are all sorts of different perspectives on what we call the American dream, right? And the American reality, than I think are old people like me. So And partly it's just part of my hopeful nature, but I do think that the younger generation will understand this in many ways, in the gut, more than people my age will.
Okay. And then this seems like a good final question. Someone is asking, what actions can I or we be taking to improve the future prospect of universal freedom and equity? This is a giant.
Okay.
I think one is reading this book and understanding the history in order to understand where we're going.
Let me go back to January 6th, because one of the contradictions I saw was the idea that people were complaining about the idea that their votes didn't count, and they were being led by a Republican Party that has been doing its best to suppress voters from voting ever since. I mean, people have said that even since Biden was inaugurated, state legislatures throughout the country have passed or introduced over 100 bills to restrict voting rights. And that's just in a few weeks. So, if I could pick one thing, I would say campaign for greater voting rights, for greater inclusion in voting, right? It is the most important thing, I think, in this day and age. And it's, the fact that we have to fight for this in the 21st century is a crying shame, but we do, right? And it's absolutely vitally important.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your scholarship with us tonight. Thank everyone for great questions. And one person's last question is this, will this be recorded? Yes, this has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube, and we'll share out some links. But again, thank you to Professor Stovall, and everyone, please have a great night, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, bye.
Bye.